Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Plains on the Prairie podcast. I'm Max,
And I'm Sam.
and today we have a special episode for you guys. We know that the Christmas season is upon us, and earlier this month we were kind of thinking, what episode could we do that would really kind of capture that holiday spirit? And Sam, you got me in touch with a book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so as some of you know, I'm a pretty avid reader. I pretty much always have a book going at some point. And you came across Donald Emerson. He's a Pembina, North Dakota native that this was while we were researching our ACEs series. His name came up as an ace, but there was some, you know, controversy of whether he was an ace or not. And we found out he was not an aerial ace. He did, as we'll find out later, destroy 7 aircraft combined between aerial and ground victories. But anyways, while looking up his name, found a book called Donald's Story, and it was a $5 used book on Amazon. I was like, well, let's give it a shot. And it's authored by Sandra Merrill, a Carlstad, Minnesota native, and a really, really good read.
Yeah, I was blown away. I think it's a unique book in the sense that it combines, historical fact. So, she includes Hitler invaded, Poland on this day, or, the Allies landed on Normandy Beach. But then she goes into a very brief history of the 4th Fighter Group and its individual squadrons, especially the one that Donald was a part of. And then it actually includes his letters.
Right. And
it's
huge.
Yeah. And it really provides an inside look into the life of such a young man who, served his country, was so eager to, fight the good fight. And I we'll talk about it more when we get into the podcast. But, you said that you can really see how the war wears him down.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And it puts this book is really good on the human factor. I wouldn't, if you're looking for a 4th Fighter Group historical book, this isn't it. This isn't your, diehard research book. It's more of a story.
Right.
And as far as I know, I'm not a 4th Fighter Group expert. I didn't see anything wrong inaccuracy wise with the historical context. And I really appreciated the context.
And I think Sandra was able to get in touch with a lot of, she, I think, wrote this in the mid to late 90s. So, yes, those veterans of the 4th Fighter Group would have been, older, but, they still remembered Donald. They still remembered, the war.
And she knew personally some of his squadron mates, which is really neat.
Yeah. And they provided insight, which, really made things interesting. So without further ado,
let's dig in. All right. So, Donald Emerson, we'll just kind of talk through his biography and we'll kind of reference the book throughout. So that's kind of how this will be. He's born May 17th, 1923 in Pembina, North Dakota. So he's kind of a younger guy going into the war, and that's going to come up later as well. He split time between Pembina and Karlstad, lived with his sister Eleanor quite a bit. He wasn't a very accomplished student, and he did not like farming.
Right.
And that was well said in the, it was gone over many times in the first few chapters.
Yeah, it's funny because, again, going back to the book, it kind of goes between, what we had just mentioned. And then, Sandra was interviewing her mom, who was Eleanor. So Eleanor had, these relationships, that she would like to focus on and talk about. And I thought that also added another aspect to the human side.
Well, and having a sibling of Donald with, the tragedy that happened, so willing to talk about it compared to her brother or his brother John. That's something, the relationship between both of them was really strong. But you can tell one took it a little more difficult than the other. But he graduated from Karlstad High School in 1941. In the book, if you do decide to buy it, it has a picture of his whole class there of like 30 some people, if that, I think. So small area, still is. But he ended up bouncing around some jobs in Chicago. He worked for a catalog company for a while, and then once the war started, he initially wanted to go to the Coast Guard, and then kind of ended up going into the Army Air Corps.
So. And I think he originally was like, well, I'll be a mechanic, or I'll be he didn't really have aspirations to fly, and then he was, the book says that he didn't really apply himself in school but he was a smart guy.
He reminds me of a lot of people we went to high school with,
Right.
you know? But no, it was interesting to see that. And, you know, his brother would have ended up getting drafted. They had a, you know, back the hardship, forget the name of the exact rule or whatever.
Based on the Sullivan brothers?
Yeah, well, no, it's more if you have, you know, someone supporting your family. His brother did support the family quite a bit with the farming. So, and if Donald didn't have any interest in farming, his logic, you know, as he said, went through the book, it's like, oh, I'll go enlist.
Yeah.
And he was trying to, you know, going as a mechanic and stuff isn't risk free, but it's lower risk than
not as risky.
Yeah, it was right. So yeah, and then he you know, did his oath here in Fargo, actually, because it was the nearest place to swear in. And then he ended up at Fort Snelling and then applied as a mechanic and then became an armorer for a short while. And he was passing the test so well. That's where that application came in. But it seems like a lot of people, at least that I know, and just a lot of stories you hear, when you get into the military, you change a little bit. You're kind of forced to apply yourself. And yeah, from there he ended up going to flight school.
Yeah, I know he did his training at Lowry, and then from there I think went to, was it Texas?
Yeah,
he
bounced
around the bases.
South Carolina and other Alabama,
Georgia,
all over the South.
Yeah, you know, it's always interesting when you read a story like that. It's like, wow, like I've been to Pembina, I've been to Chicago, I've been to Lowry or Fort Lowry.
And imagine doing all that in 3-4 months. Yeah.
Really all over the place. Yeah, especially for a small town North Dakota kid that really, other than, you know, Western Minnesota, probably didn't see much of.
Not really, no.
The United States before that.
Yeah, and then he was commissioned as a second lieutenant on October 1st of 43. So this kind of fast forwarding here through all the training. And during that time, he did find a girlfriend, Eleanor, not the same Eleanor, but yeah, he didn't have a wife or anything ever, but he seemed like kind of a ladies' man, you know, never had any serious girlfriends. But then this one gave him a lucky rabbit's foot, as one of the more famous photos of Donald is out there with him.
Yeah. And, you know, it's, again, I think we should reference the book quite a bit here. He writes about her like
every guy should write about his life.
Yeah. You know, he sets the bar very high, and it's, you know, we as readers know what happens in the end, and it's heartbreaking to go through these letters. And, you know, he's talked about having a future, and
he talked about joining an airline after the war and try to get ahead of the curve. And yeah, it's kind of the humanizing aspect is, you know, it's kind of a two-sided coin. It's really cool and then really sad at the same time if you know they have passed. But yeah, he was attached to the 4th Fighter Group at RAF Debden and with the 336 Squadron. So we'll be talking a little bit about that at the end. We're going to kind of keep this somewhat the same format as our Aces series. But yeah, and then if you want to take us through the wartime stuff a little bit.
Yeah, so upon his arrival to Europe, like you said, he was assigned to the 4th Fighter Group. And most of the time, at least early on, it was either bomber escort missions or ground interdiction. And granted, this was before D-Day.
Yes.
So in his letters, you can see him start. I mean, obviously, the letters were censored. So even for an officer, I think they did their own censoring, but I still think that they
still had certain people would take over and take their job really seriously, which you can tell he didn't like.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can see in his letters that he's talking about this buildup, and you know, he's getting super busy. And then during the, you know, actual invasion, he, like, especially Sandra does a great job of describing, you know, how busy they really were. And I think that kind of goes into the historical aspect of the 4th Fighter Group part or aspect of the book. But then after the operation, or after D-Day, you know, all of his letters are like, yeah, man, like, I am exhausted.
Right. And well, and then during his leave as well that he took in between, that's where the morale really went down, because he got to see Eleanor, he got to see his family, and then he's like, I don't want to be here anymore. Yeah. You know, it's kind of what I got out of it.
And again, the book really, it shows how dangerous it was to be a fighter pilot. And a lot of movies, like, you know, especially, you know, the ones that focus on, you know, the glamour of being a fighter pilot, they don't show that so many guys in that squadron or any squadron were killed on a daily or weekly basis. And I think it was like almost every single like paragraph or couple page spread that Sandra talked about, it was like real names, real places either were shot down or POW'd or killed.
Well, and a lot of his friends themselves were shot down, killed, or captured. And
yeah, one of his really good friends he wrote home about that. Just
it's terrible. And stuff. Yeah, he was involved in some really interesting missions, though. I mean, the Russian shuttle missions, which basically, to give a really short gist of it, is they would strike targets in Germany, deep into Germany, and then because they went so deep into Germany, they're closer to Soviet territory than they were to, RAF British or / American territory on the west. That they would just have to camp out there for a week. And I believe he was talking about how the food wasn't very good, and they basically he didn't drink, but they had their fair share of vodka. Stereotypical.
Yep.
So that was really interesting.
Yeah. The actually, speaking of the Russian shuttle missions, the photo or the book does a great job of showing pictures. It really gives you the inside scoop on Donald's life. And yeah, you mentioned the shuttle missions, and one of the color photos on the back is literally Donald after arriving back in England,
right?
Getting back from one of those.
He looks shot.
Yes, and I don't blame him. I would imagine that my behind would be very sore.
It's a long flight
after that. Yeah, but obviously as the war progressed, even after D-Day, it was still bomber missions, and he was destroying quite a few German planes on the ground.
Yes,
I think his final total came out to what, 10 or 11?
Yeah,
but I think
they confirmed 7, and then he ended up having more.
Yeah, and then but most of those either were on the ground or shared victories, which still count.
Oh
yeah, very very fascinating.
Yeah, and he didn't seem to be much of a braggart for scoring. And the 4th Fighter Group has some really famous pilots such as John Godfrey, Dominic Gentile, some of those big names. And Colonel Donald Blakesley was his squadron leader, and he talks about him a ton, how he looks up to him. And it's such a famous group and thought to be such a big group, but it seemed pretty close knit, even with the attrition they had.
And I think, especially when Donald arrived, I think, was it Blakesley that said he and Patchkey or one of his friends, they couldn't have nose art on their planes.
No.
And within, 2 or 3 months, they have, demonstrated these guys are formidable fighters. They're, aggressive. I think they said Donald, despite his size, he's a pretty short guy, but he was an aggressive fighter pilot.
And he did get more and more aggressive as the war went on. I mean, we were talking before this, and we were talking a little bit at the beginning of the podcast, that he got more of a fatalistic view on everything. Yeah. And his squadron mates started to notice he was getting more not reckless, but a little bit more fearless in his combat missions, which, produced results, but he seemed to not really expect to make it out towards the end, which is really hard to see.
I agree. And I think in the book, don't quote me on it maybe, but his brother John, like you could kind of see, especially when Sandra would interview him or talk to him, and then you would read the letter or hear the letters that John wrote to his brother. It's hard not to think that John might have taken it a little personally, and it's sad.
Well, and when your younger brother goes a place, I'm an older brother myself, and it would be weird, if my younger brother. It would be hard if something happened there. So it's, I could definitely tell there's some personal burden, and how he still, up to when this book was written, didn't really want to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And then, unfortunately, on Christmas Day, 1944, Battle of the Bulge was raging and the weather cleared. They're on a strike to, I forget the name in Germany. It was it in Germany? Well, the target was Germany, but he was returning over the American lines in Holland, and unfortunately, it was shot down by AA fire.
Yeah, because I think he got separated from his group in because the weather, yes, it had cleared, but it was still patchy.
Right.
and got lost. And I think he got jumped by 5 FW-190s, and I think he managed to get 2, but unfortunately he was downed by enemy anti-aircraft fire.
According to some accounts, he was pretty frantic over the radio and giving commentary all the way down. And some sources, I don't remember if the book stated, but they think he was killed before he hit the ground, which at least it was quick. But and his death is very overshadowed compared to another,
the same
day, George Prairie of the 352nd Fighter Group, Major George Prairie. He, those of you familiar with the Fargo Air Museum, we had Cripes and Mighty, or a plane painted like Cripes and Mighty here for many years, and he's pretty significant around here. But his death, since of his 33.5 kills and big ace status, it was overshadowing Donald's, unfortunately. But both unfortunate incidents of ground fire, and Prairie was killed by friendly fire. So, but yeah, this episode is to remind us of our loved ones. You said, I remember you had your Instagram post yesterday. You mentioned there's kind of a personal aspect to this book as well.
Yeah, my grandfather's, I didn't learn about him until I was about to graduate high school, but my grandfather's uncle, Frank Whittemore Jr., was a young second lieutenant just out of training, was assigned to the 779th Bomb Squadron of the 464th Bomb Group, based out of Italy. And first combat mission was in the lead ship of B-24J Liberator, and went down. And unfortunately, they have never found any remains. No one has been recovered. All that there really is to remember him is his name is on the list of the lost, I believe, in Italy for a memorial. And reading this book, it reminded me of my own personal research, trying to find out my great uncle's story. But the only real relation I had to him was my grandfather, who was not even, a little bit older than a toddler. Maybe, let's see, so my grandpa would have been 4 years old, 4 or 5 at the most, no older than 6 for sure, when Uncle Frank went off to war.
Right.
And all he remembers is getting 2 coins from him, and that's it. And that's all I had to really go off of. So
right. In this book, I mean, not many people wrote as many letters as Donald.
Yeah, Donald was documenting his entire path. It was so fascinating. Again, I can't stop saying it. The book is so fascinating in the sense that it really does give you an inside look into this young man's life. And it at the end, I know I told you over the phone, but for me it was emotional.
Definitely,
all this time, and this is like such an aspiring young man, and that's unfortunately how his life is ended.
Right. And Eleanor was his sister was trying to get there to Holland, where he was laid to rest, and couldn't make it. She unfortunately passed, and she was too ill to go, initially. And it was very cool to see that Sandra made it, and was able to talk with the gatekeeper for that. And
he pointed there, or his grave, I believe it's section 15, 22, or plot 22, I believe. And then at the back of the book, just looking at it now, it's almost an inside look into Sandra's family as well.
Right.
And it's so cool. Eleanor, the woman that Donald was in love with, eventually married her boyfriend that she had prior to World War II breaking out. And Eleanor's sister, who actually was the one that I guess we could talk about this more when we get into the actual Warbird section. But long story short, Eleanor's sister, she named her first son after Donald, and that son went on to become a U.S. Air Force captain flying. I think that's an F-15.
Yeah,
so,
well, it's super cool, and everybody who talked about him in the book, and he just seemed like a stand-up person, impressionable, good with kids. It just seemed like the all-around good guy, And so yeah, that's kind of our overview of Emerson, and we highly recommend you pick up this book, and we'll probably,
like Sam said, you can find it on Amazon. I know the Fargo Air Museum has 1 copy left.
Yeah.
So better hurry, because I might buy it for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we'll dig into, again, sticking to the format, kind of like our Aces series. we'll talk about the fighter group and the 336.
Absolutely.
So
the fourth fighter group, we
Cohen.
Oscar Cohen,
Yep.
One of our more popular Aces episodes, he was an actual RAF member of that squadron. So he had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, which eventually they were all, sent over to England to help fight the Germans. And the fourth fighter group was basically made up of all those Eagle squadrons. And that's why their emblem is an Eagle boxing gloves on, basically. They eventually, once they were turned over to U.S. Army Air Force control, they flew missions. I believe, what was their first air?
They started on the Spitfires, so they did fighter sweeps for the most part. Those are Mark 5 Bs, I believe, and then they moved into the 47 Cs and Ds, and then that was a short time. Then they moved into the P-51 B, and then finally the D variant.
Gotcha.
So, and the I guess a little sidebar here: the losses on the Spitfire was like somewhere around 5. It was less than 10, and the P-47 losses were very small. The majority of their losses, of their 200, and forgive me for not knowing the exact number, but 220 to 230 were in the Mustangs.
Gotcha. But how was it, like they were in the Mustangs the longest?
They were in the Mustangs the longest, and think about the missions themselves, escort missions deep into Germany. And then when they switch to ground, ground attack in a Mustang isn't as friendly as a 47.
Right.
So and then they were the first fighter group. The fourth itself was the first fighter group to escort U.S. bombers over Berlin in March of 44. So just think about that. Prior to D-Day, they were bombing Berlin on a regular basis with escort.
Right.
Yeah.
Just
not having to do it at night. And then they also participated in the Russian shuttle missions, which you did mention with Donald being a part of those. And they weren't the sole fighter group participating in that, but they were one of the first. And I guess statistically, they did very well, combined for over 1,000 aircraft in aerial and ground interdiction parties.
In the book, they mentioned that there was an almost, they didn't write about it. At least Donald didn't write about it, but there was that competition between Zemecki's Wolfpack. Am I saying?
Yeah, Zemke, Hub Zemke. Yeah,
Hub Zemke's. Wait, that was the 56th.
Yeah, with Gabreski. And,
So you have a Mustang unit and a P-47 unit, dishing it out, trying to, who can have the most kills. And I think it was after Gabreski was shot down and taken prisoner.
Yep.
And then that's when they're like, okay, like you guys need to
chill out.
Back.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and then again, I'd like to mention a couple of the aces. Dominic Salvador Gentile was the top scoring ace of the group. Dwayne Beeson was also one, and then John T. Godfrey was one. There's a book I could recommend. It's called The Look of Eagles. He wrote that. He was one of I believe he scored about 16 victories, but he was shot down towards the end of the war and spent time evading with different groups in France and Belgium. And he actually ended up passing away shortly after the war of ALS. And so the beginning and final chapters of his autobiography, it's while he wrote this while having ALS.
Wow. And
talks about his whole, thing there. And that was a really good read. I'll borrow you that.
Okay.
But the fourth fighter group, one of the more iconic ones. We have fourth fighter group Mustang here at the museum, so we'd still need to film, but we gotta get Toby on here.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
But and then now we'll dig into the aircraft that we can see nowadays.
Yeah. So when we did our ACES series, there were really only at least one, maybe two airplanes that were actually painted up as one of the ACE aircraft.
Right.
And unfortunately the P-38 Lightning was no longer around.
Right.
However, Donald Emerson's Mustang, or at least one that is painted up like his, is still around. We should go into his original Mustang was serial number 44-13317. So pretty standard low serial number D model. It was pretty common for those, at least 13,000 range, 13,000 range Mustangs.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that you mostly see that actually saw combat overseas, at least in the European theater during World War II. in the book, I know it mentions that when, and we had briefly touched on it, but when he was first assigned to the unit, he was flying P-51Bs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he and his friend were, wanting to put nose art on. And I believe it was the 336 commander, the squadron commander said, absolutely not. You guys are rookies. You don't get to do that. It's not, it's earned. It's not given. So as we see in the book, though, the two guys, really dish it out and are, they prove themselves, basically. So eventually they're re-equipped with P-51Ds, and that is where Donald gets the 13317. So to go back again, we had mentioned Eleanor, his girlfriend's sister. And the story goes that when when Donald was visiting Eleanor's family, I think for the first time, Eleanor stopped her sister on the front porch and had to tell her, hey, my friend, or my new boyfriend, Donald is here. And her sister said, and I quote, Donald, that name reminds me of Donald Duck. So the name stuck. And he eventually, he was sent back overseas, and in his place, that's where he had Donald Duck nose art painted on his P-51. And today, I should mention, he was not killed flying Donald Duck. No. He actually flew his last combat mission in a different P-51. And then Donald Duck would actually go on to survive another couple of, I think a couple months, maybe weeks, before it was also lost with its pilot, unfortunately. However, another aircraft, P-51D 74407, right?
409.
409, excuse me. We have a little connection to that too that we'll mention. But that aircraft was purchased by, what was his name?
It was Bob Toulis.
Bob Toulis, who was a famous race car driver. And Bob really, I don't know if he actually knew the story going into it, but I think from what I read just online, he liked Donald Duck and he knew that this scheme existed. And when he did more research on it, he learned more about Donald's story, and he got in touch with Sandra, and they were actually able to fly the newly repainted and restored, we'll just call it 009 for the sake of our conversation, or the new Donald Duck, to Pembina for a demonstration. He actually took Sandra up in the aircraft.
Really cool.
Super cool. Being able to fly over your hometown, and something that I can only imagine that Donald would have loved.
It would have been really cool to be at that dedication as well.
Yes, absolutely. So Bob would continue to fly the new Donald Duck for a number of years before he donated it to the American Air Museum at Duxford in England. I believe they had just revamped the new hangar in 2003, and that's where he donated it to, and it's currently on display right when you walk in. So it looks exactly, it's polished aluminum, it's in Donald's markings. It is a beautiful aircraft. Oh. And his aircraft code was VFB. So that would make it the second aircraft in the squadron. Yep. So that's really cool. Special.
Yeah.
And we had talked about this even before we recorded this episode, but the fact that a small town North Dakota kid, again, probably from one of the most desolate areas in the country at that time, even today, when you walk into such a huge museum like Duxford, you're greeted by his airplane.
Super cool.
Isn't that? It gives me goosebumps. It really does. It's super special. So interestingly, a sidebar for our sake, the aircraft, or the P-51 that Bob had repainted, is serial number 44-74409. Now, if you are a serial number nerd like me, or unfortunately like Sam, that has to hear my
turning into one,
which is good. That's not a bad thing.
Serial numbers anonymous.
74409 is actually 2 serial numbers away from 74407, which is the P-51 that is currently on display at the Fargo Air National Guard Base here in Fargo. So, and that's an aircraft that we also hope to cover one day, yes. Fingers crossed. But the fact that there's a connection to North Dakota here, there's a connection to North Dakota in England. It's you can't make this up.
No,
really
it's small world. Yeah.
It is. It's so cool. There's not a whole lot of known history on 74409. It looks like it was actually assigned to the Canadians, but after that was sold for surplus, and kind of the standard run of the mill Mustang career after the 1960s. So yeah.
No,
that kind of
wraps it up. Yeah. No, thanks for listening, guys. We wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we're going to be taking a hiatus just until the new year. We're hoping to have another B-25 update from Dave. He's doing really good work on it right now. So that's kind of our next bit here, and hopefully some other Fargo Air Museum news down the road here.
Yeah, there's a lot of really exciting stuff in the works, and we're hoping that it all comes to fruition, and we can share it with you guys as soon as we have an update on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. Happy holidays.
Yep. Merry Christmas.